Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 9 on warfare through time. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, we are still in the early modern period, 1500 to 1700. We're still looking at the nature of war, but this time we're concentrating on the armies in that 200-year period. And we'll be looking at changes that occurred during the 200 years and also things that stayed the same. Now, when we talk about nature of armies, what do we actually mean? Well, we mean the size of the army, the composition of the army, the types of soldiers that were involved. We mean strategy and tactics, how the armies were commanded, and finally, the types of uniform that these armies were wearing. That's hopefully what I will show you as we work through this video. Now, 1500 to 1700, the early modern period. For maybe the first 150 years, when we talk about size of army, we're talking about continuity. Things stayed roughly the same. And an example of that, in a couple of videos' time, I will concentrate on the Battle of Naseby, 1645, a key battle in the English Civil War. Well, at that battle, King Charles I at Naseby, his army was roughly 10 to 12,000 in size. That's pretty much the same as we've seen at the Battle of Agincourt and the Battle of Falkirk. So we could say that things have stayed the same as regards the size of the army in the first part of the period. But as we move towards the end of the early modern period, the final 50 years, 1650 up to 1700, we begin to see change. For example, the Battle of Landen towards the end of the period, King William III, his army had 50,000 soldiers. So we can see already a huge increase there. Things were beginning to change. So there's an example of continuity and change in the size of the armies. What about that key word composition, the types of soldiers involved in the army? Well, again, there's continuity, and again, there's change. Let's have a look at continuity. There was still infantry and cavalry, foot soldiers and mounted soldiers, just as there had been in earlier battles before, back into the medieval period. Again, continuity. The ratio, there was still more infantry than there were cavalry. So there we see continuity. However, yet again, some things did begin to change. Now, the changes were in the type of infantry. Think back to medieval. Most of the effective foot soldiers were the longbows, the longbowmen, the archers. In the early modern period, musketeers replaced longbowmen. Think back to the video previously when I was looking at nature of war to do with weapons. So that's one key change. Musketeers are replacing the archers or the longbowmen. A second change, and I'll mention this later in the video, armoured pikemen in squares or columns. The layout of the army is beginning to change, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll deal with that more later in this video. Another key change. Aha! Oh, Game of Thrones. Hey! Oh, it's a scary dragon. Well, not that scary. Look at him. Hey! Now, what am I on about? Dragons in the army. There's no such thing as dragons in the army in the early modern period. That's because I'm a buffoon, ladies and gentlemen. They weren't dragons, they were dragoons. D-R-A-G-O-O-N-S. Dragoons, not dragons. Sorry about that. But what were dragoons? First of all, you need to know that there weren't too many of them. A small percentage or a small proportion of the army were dragoons. What were they? Well, they were mounted infantry. So they were men who normally fought on foot, but they are on horseback, and they were carrying different types of weapons. The arquebus, or the musket. Now their tactics, they were used for skirmish, attacking the flanks quickly. Remember, they're on horseback. Later on, sometimes the dragoons would have pistols, so they could move quickly on horseback, attack particularly the flank of the enemy army. They did not wear much armour, so actually they were quite cheap. Once they'd done their skirmishing, they would often then dismount and fight. So the dragoons, not the dragons, the dragoons were a new key idea. They were a change in the composition of the army. Now, let's have a look at cavalry. Again, we see change. As I mentioned with the dragoons, cavalry often now would carry pistols, okay, and the old-fashioned sword. That replaced the long lances that they often used to fight with the knights in the medieval army. So in the early modern, the cavalry are fighting with pistols and also with swords. Now, how would they fight? Again, skirmishing, sort of hit and run tactics, moving quickly. They've got less armour as well, because the armour just gave no protection at all against the shot from other people's muskets, so therefore it was almost like a waste of time. They did have plate armour on their chest here, breast armour as it was known, chest armour, so they did have some armour, but compared to the very heavy armour of the knights in the medieval period, there was a change. They were much more mobile, they were less protected, because it was almost pointless against the shot. Now, in the medieval period, one of the key tactics of the army was the cavalry charge. Charge straight in, very, very effective. That begins to stop in the early modern period. It does come back in the English Civil War in the 1640s. So cavalry again, we see a change. And it's all to do with the weaponry, particularly the pistols, and it's to do with their armour, which leads to a change in their tactics, moving away from the charge and more towards skirmishing, hit and run tactics. Now, another type of change. Towards the end of the medieval period, I mentioned artillery and cannons were beginning to be introduced. As they moved into the early modern period, this continued. So we have a gradual increase in the use of cannon. Towards the end of the period, far more cannon were used. It led to a change in the supply trains because they got to bring the cannon with them and all the supplies needed, the huge cannonballs, etc. So artillery begins to be introduced more in the early modern period. Now, let's move to strategy and tactics. Well, again, let's start with continuity. There was some continuity. Some things stayed the same compared to medieval. Well, what were they? Sieges were still used. Land was still controlled by forts and fortified towns and cities. So it wasn't just battles, it was control of land that was still an important tactic in the early modern. That was similar to medieval. But again, there were some changes. And the changes in strategy and tactics linked very closely to the changes in weapons. Because the weapons have changed, we see that the tactics have to change. In many medieval battles, the archers, the longbowmen were put on the flanks. The knights, whether they were mounted or dismounted, often fought in the centre. In early modern battles, the layout of the army begins to change. Infantry, musketeers, remember, or pikemen, often fought in squares, ladies and gentlemen. The cavalry, the mounted soldiers, were now often on the flanks. And in between these squares of infantry, whether they're musketeers or pikemen, quite often the artillery, the cannon, was placed. So there's a difference in layout in the army. Now, I use the word squares there. That is a key change, ladies and gentlemen. Let's make sure we understand what we're talking about. In the way that the army was laid out in early modern times, in these squares, musketeers, the men firing the muskets, flintlock, matchlock, remember from our previous video, and the men carrying the pikes, the long poles, the pikemen, they had to work together. If they did not work together, ladies and gentlemen, they would be wiped out. They were weak on their own, which would have led to death. Because there were reasons for that. If you are a musketeer, yes, you fire your shot, but remember, you are very slow to reload. So whilst you were reloading, the cavalry, the enemy cavalry, could ride you down and kill you. So the musketeers had weaknesses because they were slow to reload. Therefore, the pikemen had to step in and protect the musketeers whilst they were reloading against the cavalry. Okay? So that's why the pikemen would help the musketeers. At the same time, pikemen were challenged by the enemy musketeers, or cavalry with pistols. So the pikemen needed their musketeers to fire to protect them. Can you see that the musketeers and the pikemen needed to work together to protect each other? And if they're working together, it means they had to train and they had to practice, because they needed to be able to move and do different tasks to protect each other. And quite often, in the heat of battle, they would use a different drum beat to send signals to sort of introduce the changes in formation. Right, pikemen, come over here quickly. We need you to protect the musketeers. And they would send a drum beat as a signal. Or musketeers, quick, fire to protect the pikemen over there. A different drum beat. So these squares of musketeers and pikemen working together, practicing, training, was a key change. Okay, now I've mentioned the idea of squares. There were two types of squares, ladies and gentlemen. The first one, 1590s, came from the Netherlands, known as the Dutch square, introduced by Prince Maurice of Nassau. And basically, what he decided to do was say, right, I'm going to have my musketeers in 6 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all facing the enemy. The first row would fire. Remember, it's going to take them quite a while to reload. They don't want to stand at the front whilst they're reloading, so they move to the back, and the second row is now at the front. The second row can fire, and they move to the back and begin reloading. The third row fires, they move to... Can you see what's happening? So because there's always a row ready to fire and everyone else is reloading, you are introducing the concept of continuous fire, which was very, very effective. That was the first type of model, the Dutch square, 1590s. The second square, Sweden. Move on a bit. The 1620s, King Gustav Adolf from Sweden. Again, he's got his men in 6 rows. But instead of firing a row at a time, what the Swedish model did was they had their square a little bit like that, ladies and gentlemen. Here at the front, the first row, you've got men kneeling down. In the second row, you've got men crouching. and in the third row you've got men standing. So what you could do then is all three rows could fire a volley. Bang! Very, very effective. Then they move to the back, and then the next three rows move forward, kneeling, crouching, standing, and then when they're firing, the other three are reloading. So it's a slightly different variation on the Dutch square, the Swedish square, known as the Swedish salvo. So there's two examples there of changes. The musketeers firing their shots either in individual rows or rows of three. The squares, a key change, ladies and gentlemen, in early modern warfare. What's the advantages of the squares? Can you think of any? Well, here's a few for you. Number one, continuous fire. Important. Number two, they are firing as a group. The early muskets were not particularly accurate. So if you are firing as a group, you are increasing your chances of hitting the target. Effective. Number three, the pikes in the squares gives protection from all sides. So the pikemen in squares, extra protection. There was something called pikemen versus pikemen. Instead of having their, imagine that's a big long pike, it's only a sword, but imagine if it's very, very long. Instead of having it facing out, they lifted it up like that. And then what they basically did is the whole square pushed forward against the enemy square. It was called push of pike. And then once you push them, and if they run, then you can follow them and hopefully defeat them. The push of pike. Another advantage, it increased mobility. You've got squares of pikemen next to squares of musketeers. They're able to move a lot easier, and it increased the final advantage, number 6, flexibility. If one square was defeated, it could easily be replaced by another. In the medieval times, when the soldiers often were in rows, if the row broke, if the line broke, it could often lead to total rout of an army very, very quickly. That was avoided. That was changed by the introduction of the squares. They're more mobile, they're more flexible, they're more adaptable. They increase the fire, they increase the accuracy and push of pike. The 6 advantages, all there for you with the squares, ladies and gentlemen. And the final point, uniform. Now, we know that there are soldiers' uniforms today. Go back into medieval times and it wasn't particularly like that. In the early modern period, particularly in the Civil War, people begin to start wearing the same type of uniform, the same type of colour, the same type of dress, mainly to avoid confusion of different colours. Battle of Edge Hill, 1642, in the English Civil War. Parliament's army wore orange scarves as a sign that they are all on the same side. The new model army, which we'll have a look at in a later video, we see that they are beginning to wear a regular type of uniform. One bonus, of course, was it was far more difficult to run away and desert if you are wearing a uniform. Gradually, out of all of this, we get the red coats that the British Army wore into the next period, which we'll do about later, mainly because at the time it was probably the cheapest dye, but we'll deal with that later. So, hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a look at the nature of warfare in early modern period, looking at the armies. Yes, some things did stay the same, but also note, some things did change. As ever, I hope it's been useful. Our next video, ladies and gentlemen, we're still in early modern period, but we are looking at the experience of war. So that's coming soon. All the best now. Speak to you soon. Bye now.